For many of us, the build-up to World War II is fairly common knowledge, and most typically the blame is pinned squarely on German expansionism. The timeline of events seemingly reinforces this. 1936, Germany seizes and remilitarizes the Rhineland, expressing its goal to create a greater German state through limited expansion. King Edward VIII of Britain allows this, but is eventually forced to abdicate. Germany, Japan, and Italy leave the League of Nations at various points and join the Anti-Comintern Pact some years later. All three make notable annexations during the 1930s. 1938, in line with Germany's vision of bringing the Germanic people under a single state, Austria is annexed, and after much contention, the Western powers allowed Germany to annex the Sudetenland as well, in essence allowing for the eventual breakup of the Czechoslovak state. Britain would justify the action as a necessary appeasement of the Germans, who along with the British stood as pillars of peace and security against Bolshevism. This would, however, be the last expansion Britain would tolerate. The Germans in turn promised that Czechoslovakia would be their last territorial demand made in Europe, something which appeared to herald the beginning of peaceful relations between the Germans and British, but this promise quickly revealed itself to be made on shaky ground as the Free City of Danzig and the Polish Corridor were demanded soon after, prompting Britain and France to provide Poland a guarantee of support against potential German aggression, hoping they could take the Germans at their word, but preparing should that not be the case. It's important to note that there's a lot of nuance that's being glossed over here, and we'll try to cover some of that later on in this video. Moving forward, Italy would annex Albania the following year, with little backlash from the West. This having been a potential test of Western dedication to preventing further annexations by the Axis, one which only emboldened Germany. The Germans, feeling confident the city of Danzig and Poland as a whole were beyond the interests of Britain and France, would continue to gamble with its eastern demands, which it assumed felt closer to the interests of the USSR. The Germans and Soviets thus would come into agreement for how authority in the East should be divided. The Soviets, having found little support from the West in achieving their own goals of expansion, would put forward to Germany their ambitions in Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Poland, and Romania, while Germany expressed its interests in Lithuania and Poland. Coming to terms with their place in Europe as pariahs to the Western democracies, the two would establish a special relationship for shared dominance in Eastern Europe, and it'd be decided in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that Poland would be divided between the two, the Soviets further being free to expand into their desired Western territories unhindered. With both Germany and the USSR mounting a joint effort against Poland, there was a sense that Western involvement would now be fully discouraged. However, because the guarantee to Poland only guaranteed against a German act of aggression, and because the Soviets launched their invasion a few days after Germany's own, the USSR managed to get away with its role in the effort, proceeding to impose itself upon other lands of interest while Germany, France, and Britain duked it out. Of course, Germany would occupy France, find itself in stalemate with Britain, later declare war on the US and USSR, and eventually face defeat. Post-war, Germany was reduced of power and stripped of its annexed lands. However, the Soviets emerged stronger than ever before, now holding a sphere of influence in Europe which included Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and a portion of Germany, in addition to all territories it held interest in prior, paving the way for nearly a half-century of global competition between itself and the US as the world's leading powers. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate timeline, the Soviets, and only the Soviets, invaded Poland? Before going any further, I'd like to take a minute to thank today's sponsor, the Ridge Wallet. Don't you wish you had some way to organize all your stuff in a neat little carrying case you can carry with you? Like a wallet. But wait, you don't mean this, do you? This must be one of those newfangled portable chargers the kids are talking about. It's so sleek and futuristic. Tell me, are you tired of big bulky wallets that make you look like you just crammed half your belongings into your pocket? Then you need the Ridge Wallet. Believe it or not, this compact receptacle can carry up to 12 cards and more cash than you probably know what to do with. It's ridiculous. Odds are you're probably carrying a wallet made out of some kind of leather, that's great, but with Ridge you're getting a wallet made out of only the finest ingredients. We're really talking high grade quality here. Aluminum, titanium, carbon fiber. If that sounds impressive to you, it's because it is. Durability, utility, beauty, we're looking at the wallet you might spend the rest of your life with right here. Why? I just said why. 1, it's easy to use, keeps everything neat and orderly. 2, it looks fantastic. You're gonna get questions about where you got this. It's a conversation starter. 3, these materials are tough as nails. You don't need to worry about this thing falling apart one day. Won't matter if it does, because every wallet comes with a lifetime warranty. Still not sure if it's right for you? Tell you what, we're so confident of this product that you get 45 days to try it out, see if it's right for you. If not, you can return it for a full refund. Right now, you can get yourself a Ridge wallet with a 10% discount and free shipping when you go to ridge.com/MonsieurZ and use promo code MonsieurZ at checkout. Links in our description. Now, back to the video. On the surface, it might seem as simple as having the Soviets initiate World War II, thus pitting Britain and France against the USSR instead of Germany, with the Germans possibly acting as a supporting power to either side, depending on how we go about reaching this outcome. Realistically, however, it's much more complicated. The events which motivated Britain's declaration of war upon Germany progressively built to that point over a period of multiple years, and held their basis in a historic animosity between the two states, which framed the Germans as the new France of the European continent, that meaning the most present threat to Britain's global dominance. The Soviets, in contrast, though perceived as an enemy to the West because of their communist ideology, were far less capable of threat to Britain and its balance of power. Soviet interests of the time laid squarely in Eastern Europe on account of Stalin's policy of socialism in one country, and thus hardly impacted Britain's political or economic agenda at all. Whereas Germany had historically demonstrated global ambitions and immediate gains in Western Europe, not to mention attempted exclusion of Britain from continental affairs. Although such was not necessarily the case for Germany's then-present regime, which sought collaboration between itself and the British, but understandably Britain was hesitant to believe this claim. In truth, there was a great deal of miscommunication which soured genuinely benevolent actions between Germany and Britain to come to a mutual understanding. Britain not wishing to make Germany feel cornered and oppressed, while the Germans attempted not to tread on matters which directly concerned the British. However, the two wound up distrusting each other, opening the doors to hostilities. Poland had a role to play in this decaying of relations, as despite attempting to remain a neutral party between Russia and Germany, it tended to antagonize both by painting the Germans as natural aggressors and the Soviets as expansionist and subversive. Germany attempted to make Poland an ally against what it perceived as an inevitable alliance between the British, French, and Soviets, expecting Poland to seek a realistic ally against Soviet expansion. But the Poles instead opted to align themselves closer with France and Britain, essentially encircling Germany and leaving it on high alert. Where Hitler once tolerated Poland's claims to the corridor, now any fair play by Germany was seen as potentially conceding a vital asset to the enemy, and so an aggressive position was adopted. Aside from the Soviets holding interests outside of Britain's own, the British were not quite capable of directly combating the Soviets effectively, needing to do so through various proxies just to reach them, whereas Germany could be immediately attacked by sea, by air, by routing land forces through France, Belgium, Denmark, or the Netherlands. This meant that if the Soviets alone invaded Poland, there wasn't much Britain could do to stop them in time. Further, there wasn't much desire to even attempt such a thing, as while Germany's expansion to Poland represented a threat to British security, and a violation of a recent promise which made Britain look weak and foolish, the Soviets, who had yet to make significant claims and lost a good deal of Imperial Russia's western territories, were expected to settle various remaining border disputes created in the post-Great War world. This had actually been part of the justification behind much of the expansions made by the Axis, some in the West seeing the annexations by Italy and Japan as former allies simply claiming their rightful due, while Germany's remilitarization of the Rhineland was seen as, quote, the Germans walking into their own backyard. That said, if the Soviets alone invaded Poland, not only would the resources needed to stop them arrive too slowly and require undesired exhaustion on the part of Britain, but the Soviets could easily justify themselves to the already apathetic, still recovering Europe as merely undoing an illegal expansion of Poland beyond what even Britain itself had proposed as its eastern border, subjecting several Ukrainians and Belarusians who occupied the region to the Polish government. We might see some condemnation like what followed the expansions of Italy and Japan, but eventually the move would be accepted and the Soviets would face no major consequences, thus never triggering World War II. The Soviets also lacked the alliances which would have properly made this a world war. They certainly had global enemies, but merely invading Poland likely wouldn't draw the forces of Britain, Japan, and the US against them. Even still, this lacks any potential for a campaign in Africa like the North or East African campaigns of our world, making any conflict to emerge out of this more of an anti-Soviet war than a world war. With that in tow, it doesn't seem likely that the Soviets alone could have triggered World War II at this time, at least nowhere near the scale that Germany had on account of its then-present capabilities, historic rivalry with Britain, and relationship to other expansionist powers like Italy and Japan. That said, let us still consider what might have happened had the Soviets invaded Poland without Germany, or, in still maintaining the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, invaded Poland first, allowing Germany to later sweep in under the guise of defending Poland from further Soviet expansion. Unlike the Germans, who utilized expert leadership, sharpened tactics, and synergistic cooperation between its land and air forces to invade and occupy Poland in a matter of weeks, the Soviets would find themselves bogged down in a several-month-long conflict the likes of the Winter War in Finland. See, while we often remember the USSR as having been this juggernaut of a state, prior to and even during the Second World War, it fell far short of being the global superpower it would later become, many of its military victories and conquests of the time easily being attributed to factors outside their own control, even the post-war occupation of Eastern Europe having in tremendous part been aided by the sheer devastation sustained by these states, and the inability of the Western powers to act against it. It would only be following their entry into the Second Great War that the Soviets finally began taking major steps toward building a stronger military and international capabilities, as national focus had previously remained fixed inward on industrializing, consolidating power, and reforming old Russian systems to the new Soviet model. Countries like Finland, Poland, and the Baltic states remained exceptions to this rule because of their historic place as former parts of the Russian Empire. As Stalin consolidated power and began developing crucial lands within the USSR, it became clear to him how necessary Western buffers were to the security of the Union's major cities. In his mind, dominance of these bordering countries was crucial to the success of socialism in one country, even if the states themselves weren't communist but merely friendly. Now, the Poles were easily more formidable a force than the Finns in regard to air and manpower, so much so that escaped Polish pilots went on to play instrumental roles in Britain's own air campaigns against Germany later on. This means that the Soviets would be held off quite effectively by the Poles, preventing Germany from justifiably stepping in, although an offer is likely made for a German-Polish alliance. Poland would have held out hoping to receive aid from France or Britain, but both would hesitate, leaving Poland's sole ally in the conflict to be the Kingdom of Romania, with whom Poland had a long-standing relationship aimed at preventing Russian or German dominance in Eastern Europe. Eventually, much as was the case during the Winter War, the Soviets would muster a partial victory through both overwhelming numbers and improved military leadership, annexing all lands east of the Curzon Line. The drawn-out nature of the conflict and Poland's refusal to accept German support prevents Germany from intervening, leaving an independent but reduced Poland stuck between its two larger neighbors. Post-war, the Soviets would have learned from their shortcomings in Poland and initiated a series of military developments, though having emerged victorious would feel emboldened and immediately turn their attention to the Baltic states and Finland. One might argue by this point, certainly one of the Western powers would have intervened, but often is forgotten what occurred in our timeline, when there was roughly an 8-month period between France and Britain's declaration of war on Germany and the actual initiation of any large-scale military action by the Western powers. If in this alternate world the Second Polish-Soviet War failed to attract a Western response, we could imagine an equal period of delay in responding to the Soviet invasion of the Baltics and Finland. Even in our world, France and Britain had attempted to support Finland in the Winter War, however found Norway and Sweden unwilling to cooperate in the transportation of goods and soldiers, out of fear that they themselves might be drawn into the conflict. An invasion and occupation of Norway was also considered by the West to assist Finland, but only because it would have benefited their position against Germany, whom they would have then been at war with. Absent Germany's role in the invasion of Poland, it's far less likely an aggressive approach would have been taken in Scandinavia, leaving the Finns to their own devices and, as in our world, making minor concessions to the USSR, but emerging with its sovereignty intact. To avoid a timeline in which World War II is simply delayed, we'll assume that Germany decides to abandon any future plans of invading Poland, but instead seeks to subjugate it politically, much as it had done to Romania via the German-Romanian Economic Treaty, which gave Germany a bounty of Romanian resources in exchange for military training and equipment, as it appeared the Soviets were shifting their attention to Romanian lands. In the case of Poland, Germany might demand a leasing or co-ownership of the Polish corridor, also in exchange for military resources to defend itself against another Soviet incursion. In the months following the Second Polish-Soviet War, Poland and its ally of Romania would foster a closer relationship as they increasingly feared their more powerful neighbors. Finland too would be drawn into this alliance of neutral states, having itself received military support from Germany to prevent a total Soviet conquest. Behind the scenes, Germany was playing a manipulation game, knowing well it couldn't make any further annexations in Europe without provoking the fury of Britain and France. It instead resorted to an old strategy of political domination, previously attempted during the Kaiser's Empire, a union plan then known as Middle Europa, which now remanifested itself as it had during the war in our timeline, when Germany increasingly relied on support from its non-German client states, and, witnessing the cooperation between these forces, began shifting away from the concept of a greater Germanic empire stretching far into the east, and instead toward a union of independent nation-states with Germany as its nucleus. Germany would exploit Polish desperation and that of its allies to feed the abandoned concept of an Eastern European political entity which stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, an intermarium. This plan, originally proposed by Poland, was intended to serve as a great buffer to Russian expansion westward and German expansion eastward, ensuring the sovereignty and security of its neutral constituent states. The plan, however, was plagued by numerous issues, foremost being a lack of cooperation between many of its vital players, disagreements over Poland's leading role in the plan, skepticism over Polish intent to use the alliance to break up Russia, and the loss of some member states to annexation. Now it would be back on course with total German subsidization, fostering dependencies in Poland, Finland, and Romania, which would be ripe for the picking once the covertly planted seeds for anti-Soviet resistance finally sprouted. Germany had in essence, through one-sided treaties and political manipulation, made the governments, militaries, and economies of these three states subject to Germany's whims, in exchange for the means with which to combat the communists and take back all they had lost, believing throughout the process that the Intermarium plan could still ensure their independence from both Russia and Germany, despite the Germans pulling the strings this whole time, and gradually bringing them closer to their way of thinking, producing what amounted to an eerie parallel of the Eastern Bloc, but now with Germany as the leading power behind it. Recognizing that the Soviets were improving their military based upon how the wars in Finland and Poland had progressed, the Between Seas Alliance stressed the urgency of launching a joint campaign before the USSR became too powerful. The time would finally come as the Soviets now appeared ready to invade Romania, having long claimed right to the eastern land of Bessarabia, though no doubt prepared to take more if the opportunity presented itself. As in our world, an ultimatum would be issued to Romania for a full withdrawal from the region, but rather than simply concede to the terms as they had in our timeline, the Romanians would retaliate in force, taking the Soviets by surprise as they launched their assault alongside two simultaneous invasions from the north and west. Supplemented by German resources and manpower, the three states would push deep into Soviet territory, the Finns occupying Leningrad and much of the northwestern coast, the Poles annexing the whole of Belarus, and the Romanians liberating the Ukraine from Soviet rule, depriving the USSR of significant agricultural and industrial land, thus dampening any threat it might pose in the future. By invading Poland alone, the Soviets would have spared Germany an excruciating war with Britain, which would have inevitably hampered the Germans' later war effort against them, but in this alternate world, that never happens. Because the USSR cripples Poland without triggering a larger war, Germany is able to more effectively dominate its smaller eastern neighbor without resorting to military confrontation, much like it would have done with Hungary and Romania. Appealing to the shared concerns of the USSR's border states and exploiting knowledge of Soviet plans for expansion, Germany would bring together these relatively small powers into a unitary front they themselves had previously considered. Having nurtured goodwill and dependency from these states while bolstering their armies to take on their shared foe, Germany would come away with a hub of economic and military power in Eastern Europe, hand-delivered to it by its three grateful allies. And that is where I'll end this video for now. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Support your legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.